If you're going to talk about performing arts programs, you have to deal with the programs that Nathan Kroll produced. You have to deal with the Martha Graham programs. You have to deal with the Pablo Casals master class. He was indeed a force. It was Nathan Kroll that produced all of these great performing arts shows from the late 60s on through the 80s. When you see the programs, there's a quality and intelligence to the shows, and that certainly made up who Nathan Kroll was. He was a very quick-witted man, but he also had a deep concern for education and the arts. Before Nate became a producer of arts programming on television, he had a tremendous background that gave him the experience of arts in many different ways. He began as a violinist, a very well-known prodigy in the New York circles, trained at Juilliard, but unfortunately was not able to continue to become that master violinist. The Depression disrupted his career, and he looked at other forms of the musical experience. We're so lucky that he tied up with radio at that time and began to compose and create music for radio programming. And I think probably in that experience that he learned about communication, that you could communicate the artistic experience on a mass medium. The thing about arts programming in the 50s is that it was very rare. I think there was one series, and it was on the commercial networks called Omnibus, and that sort of defined what arts programming was. The paradigm was Leonard Bernstein talking to you and telling you the history of Beethoven, telling you the history of jazz. It was very much a pedagogical classroom situation, and Nathan Kroll was able to take new concepts and bring them to arts programming. He didn't take the Bernstein paradigm with one lecturer telling you what is good. He allowed you to experience the art itself. He created forms that allowed the artist to speak directly to the public. In the 50s, there was very little public television. There were only a smattering of stations around the country. There was not a unified network. It was just a series of isolated stations. They were looking for a link-up that would bring the arts programs to different stations across the country. There were no dance programs on television at all. There were no formulas for dance, and in fact, it was Nate Kroll who developed all the different ways and innovations to bring dance to television. So Nate Kroll, in developing the dance program, also helped create that network, helped foster the idea of not just localized programs for one community, but the idea of having national programs that an audience could experience art at its highest level. Before Nate, television was a live experience, and it was really experienced more in the medium shot. You really couldn't go to the close-up that much in live television. But Nate always did his television programs on film, very much thinking in cinematic terms. And he certainly understood in all his film work that the close-up was a paramount way of communicating, so that you have all the great artists seen in close-up. You actually can read their faces as you hear them communicate. There's no doubt that Martha Graham changed modern dance. Perhaps you could say she changed modern culture. She brought a whole new emphasis to culture. But to understand Martha Graham, you can't just do it through her dances. You have to understand that person. I think one of the best ways to understand who Graham was is through Nate Kroll's documentaries. The great thing about the Martha Graham films is that you're peering into an artistic temperament that would change 20th century. In many ways, he gave a rare window into her artistic soul.
And then there comes a moment when she looks at you in the mirror and you realize that she's looking at you and recognizing you as herself.
When Nate was working on the Graham films, he was working with a team of people that helped him discover how do you translate the artistic experience to a television experience. He worked with the director Peter Glishonik in thinking about dance in television terms. It was a collaborative effort between Nate, Peter, and Martha that resulted in two very remarkable documents of dance, A Dancer's World and Appalachian Spring. You could see that they all worked together. It was not just the vision of one person. It was not just Martha Graham or Nate Kroll, but it was all three working together to come up with something that was transcended their own individual vision. In the late 50s, they were very much confined by the technology. Nate was using a single film camera. It was rather laborious. They only could do bits and pieces of the dance. But the way the finished product turned out, it was almost as if Nate was working with video technology of the 70s. He shot dance very much like dance in America would shoot dance 20 years afterwards. He laid down the formula. His artful mixture of both close-ups and medium shots allowed the viewer to experience dance on a whole different level. a closer experience for the television viewer. You didn't see it the way you saw on stage. You didn't see it in one full, long shot, but you saw both close-up and medium shot, and that gave you the experience. Very interesting, especially for the Martha Graham dances, that the Noguchi sets were so important. You never really saw the set in its entirety, but you saw different elements of it, and I think that created a whole new experience for seeing Graham both in space, but also part of her own environment, too.
If you go up, you have to go up in spite of the piano. Otherwise, it's something that it's not free, not music, what the music intends. Now,
The thing about the masterclass is that it's astounding in the early 60s, the idea of putting 25 different programs on Pablo Casals onto television. I mean, no one ever thought about taking it serious and making it on the artistic experience.
Very well, continue.
It was just a great concept, but you can really see that you're in the very beginning of public television, that any ideas were possible in those early days. The artistic process is not just a 90-minute special, but it exists over time, and Nate Kroll was able to create that form and bring you into a master class as it unfolded over time. Many of the artists were really old school. They came from a very disciplined art form, and they really only talked to their community. Most of these artists had never appeared on television. They had no idea what mass communications was. And it was Nate Kroll who helped them begin a relationship with this new medium. Nate, working with a Martha Graham or a Heifetz, allowed them to communicate to a much larger audience, but he also gave them the ability to do that. Another form that Nate innovated on television was the idea of process. How do you bring television to communicate the artistic process? He took that to another level with his masterclass programs. The masterclasses were not just about the individual art of Casals with the cello or Heifetz with the violin, but it was how you pass along knowledge, and I think that was the great thing, that Nate had the cameras to show both the teacher but also the student. You saw the thoughts of the teacher and then the eyes of illumination in the students. And then, of course, the student was also the audience watching this rare communication.
You're still in one piece.
It was a whole idea of what wisdom is and how you pass it along. I'm sure that he had a personal feeling when he was filming Jascha Heifetz. Heifetz was someone he wanted to be, and sure, that program meant more to him than all the programs that he worked on, because here was his idol, Heifetz, teaching a class.
To a sound which is way, way up. The hero comes. So, I tried again. What are you, 11?
He wanted to be both the student probably in that class, but he also probably personally also wanted to teach that class. And I'm told by his widow, Claire, that throughout his entire career, Nate Kroll always thought himself as a violinist. Perhaps his ambitions were thwarted, but in the back of his mind, he always wanted to be that violinist. We're fortunate that he took those thwarted ambitions and became a great filmmaker instead.
Now, che mai de Dio nel penetral più sacro di mia magione. You see, okay, somebody with your wife. Then do not make the note so long. Go to the point immediately.
So he begins the masterclass in the early 60s with Casals, but he extends it into the 80s with Pavarotti, a whole different type of artist, so the shows are very different. With Casals or Heifetz, you have old school musicians talking to students, a very dignified, sort of austere approach. But with Pavarotti, you have a whole new way of communicating.
And after, when she leaves the room, then you say, oh, that. And you become a singer. But before, you are a furious husband.
Pavarotti understood the mass medium, so there's more of a warmth, an understanding of the possibilities of communication. So with these master classes by Nate, you have an understanding in 20 years of how the artists have changed. And that really shows how television influenced the arts, that you really can't just be standoffish, a cultural elite with television. You have to be more engaging. Certainly Pavarotti and a lot of the artists who have come afterwards understood that. In 1964, Nate produced The Guns of August, which was a whole new direction for him. He decided to adapt Barbara Tuchman's book, to the feature film. It was an anniversary of World War I, and he wanted to do something that would bring a new knowledge or understanding to the war. And he also showed that he never wanted to remain static. We think of Nate's work for the arts documentary, but Nate could work in documentary form no matter what. In the late 50s, Bell Telephone Hour began as a variety series. For the most part, it was performances on the stage, very much like live television. But in the mid-60s, they decided to change the formula and create documentaries on film. Nate brought his own understanding of the artistic process to these documentaries. And again, you went into the mind of the artist. You went into the minds of George Zell. You went into the minds of Benjamin Britten. Nate not only dealt with a more adult audience, but he could also deal with a family audience, and he could bring kids into the artistic experience. He worked with Joan Sutherland to create Who's Afraid of Opera, and in many ways he borrowed some of the elements of, we'll say, Sesame Street to create an experience that would be not just for the enlightened audience, but for a new audience of youngsters.
I played the part of Philine, the star of a troupe of traveling players. We've stopped here on the way to a performance.
Hey, look what's coming! Gypsies!
That was the essence of Nate Kroll, that he was able to take the best of Western civilization, whether it be art, music, and bring that experience to the living rooms across America. He was not the type of filmmaker who just threw his copies in a drawer. He was very concerned about how he would pass on his own legacy to future generations of art lovers. Nate's foresight allowed us to enjoy his programming.